my gosh. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I wanted to welcome everyone to the first presentation in what is the 5th year of our speaker series, Toxicology and Societies, the Impact of Chemicals in Our Lives. I'm Ruth Sofield, and I'm an environmental toxicology and chemistry professor at Western Washington University. And I'm joined by my two wonderful co-hosts, Ian Moran, who's a visiting assistant professor of environmental toxicology at Western. Hi, Ian. And Tracy Collier, who's a toxicologist, retired from NOAA, but he still works as a consultant. Hi, Tracy.
Hi there, Ruth.
Welcome.
Yeah.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homes of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join us in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. I'd like to go over a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use this feature to interact. The focus of our speaker series is to provide understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and societies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Kristina Marusic, an award-winning journalist who covers environmental health and justice for Environmental Health News, and the author of A New War on Cancer, The Unlikely Heroes Revolutionizing Prevention. Today, she will discuss the perspective she developed in her book that the war on cancer is winnable if we revolutionize the way we fight. Welcome, Kristina.
Hi, thank you so much, Ruth. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Does that look right? Can I just get a thumbs up from someone?
It looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking with you all today. I always like to start this talk with a question, which is, if you invented a pill that could cure 2/3 of all cancer cases, how much money do you think you would make? And my guess is that you would probably be somewhere in the realm of like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos level wealthy if you invented that pill. And then the follow-up question is, if we knew how to prevent 2/3 of all cancer cases, but nobody stood to get rich from it, would we still think we should do it? And of course, I'm sure everyone here today would have a strong yes to that. And there's really good news about that, and there's also some bad news about that. And I'll give you the good news first. The good news is that up to 2/3 of all cancer cases are caused by exposures that we know we can prevent. This figure comes from the US President's Cancer Panel, and it's actually conservative. A study conducted by the National Institutes of Health puts this number even higher. They say that 90 to 95% of cancer cases are caused by preventable factors. Sorry, this is the wrong slide. Give me 1 second. Yep, okay, no, it's the right side, sorry. I apologize. Okay, so one theory of cancer risk that I have found really helpful is the causal pie model. And this idea comes from epidemiology. So some of you here today might be intimately familiar with the look of these charts. And this theory, this model says that we all have our own kind of pie chart for cancer risk, or any other disease. But when we're using it to talk about cancer risk, this might include things like genetic risk factors, exposure to cigarette smoke, exposure to pesticides, and exposure to air pollution. And everyone's pie chart is unique with a unique mix of factors in each of those slices of pie. But if any single risk factor goes missing, then cancer will not develop in that person. And that would mean and again, this is just one theory of how cancer risk works. But if this one proves true, that would mean that if we remove even one of the risk factors that's common in a lot of people's pies, we could prevent many cases of cancer. which is a really exciting idea. The bad news is that all of our market incentives are pushing us to continue focusing solely on treatments for cancer rather than prevention. This chart comes from a market research company that serves investors. And as you can see, the global oncology market was valued at $286 billion in 2021, and it's expected to reach over $581 billion by 2030. This box of text on the left is from the same webpage, and I highlighted the part where they're citing the fact that cancer, this is in quotes, cancer cases are expected to rise by 47% from 2020 to 2040 as evidence of strong growth for the market. And unfortunately, there's no similar market projection for cancer prevention. So in other words, a lot of people stand to get Jeff Bezos level rich or pretty close to it by investing in treating cancer, but no one stands to make huge financial profits by investing in cancer prevention. And I want to emphasize, of course, that developing new treatments and cures for cancer is extremely important, and I would never say that we should do less of that. But while we continue to search for a cure, we also need to do more to prevent cancer. And since it's clear that this isn't going to come from inside the market, that means we'll need to rely on policies and regulations to get that done. So these are some of the reasons I wrote my book. But like most people, I've also had my own personal experiences with cancer that made me want to look into this topic a little more. In 2011, my younger sister Abby was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and she was just 25 years old at the time, which is very young for a cancer diagnosis. It really caught my whole family off guard. And thyroid cancer usually runs in families. There's usually a genetic component, but no one else in ours has ever had it. So at the time, her doctors said, oh, in that case, then maybe environmental factors played a role. But when we asked questions about that and pushed for more information, they really didn't have much to offer in the way of an explanation. I'm also an investigative journalist, and so years later in 2019, I was still thinking about those questions when I wrote a 5-part series on cancer and environmental exposures in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, which is where my sister and I live. It was titled Prescription for Prevention, and these are some of the headlines from that series. The series won a couple awards, and I got a note from a publisher congratulating me and asking if I'd be interested in expanding these ideas into a book with a more national focus. And 5 short years later, this is that book. It came out last year in May. I had a lovely introduction, so I won't tell you too much more about me and my work. I've been a reporter for environmental health news since 2018. Before that, I freelanced covering a wide range of issues, including the environment and social justice, for a whole bunch of news outlets. I live in Pittsburgh, as I mentioned, with my partner and our dog, Mochi. And she may make a guest appearance behind me at some point today, but in case she doesn't, I usually pull her up because, as you can see here, she's a very good dog. This is my sister. My sister made a full recovery from her thyroid cancer. She had her thyroid removed and has been in remission for more than a decade. This is her with her husband and her 2 very cute kids and their goofy golden doodle, who is also a good dog. I'll also tell you a little bit more about Environmental Health News. We're a news organization that was founded by a scientist named Pete Myers, who is an expert on endocrine disrupting chemicals. You may have heard his name. He was also the co-author of a book called Our Stolen Future that's about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And our mission is to drive good science into public policy and public discussions on our environment and health. We have a number of popular newsletters focused on environmental health, including Above the Fold, and then we also do original reporting. We cover a lot of national news with a pretty heavy focus on toxics and emerging research related to toxics, but I do investigative stories about environmental health issues here in Western Pennsylvania. And we also just launched a Texas bureau focused on covering petrochemicals and the oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico. This is what I'll plan to talk about today. So first I'm going to go through some of the new research and opportunities for cancer prevention, how the war on cancer is going so far. My book is structured through profiles of people who are working to prevent cancer by preventing us from being exposed to so many toxic chemicals in our everyday lives. So I'll talk about a few of those folks, and then I'll share some resources for getting involved in this work. Some of the things that I learned while I was reporting on environmental exposures in cancer were really shocking to me. And the first was that since we started tracking cancer incidence in the 1970s, rates of childhood cancer have been steadily increasing. This chart is in the United States, but this trend is generally mirrored at the global level. Whenever you look at childhood cancer charts over time in pretty much any part of the world, the line is going up across the page like this. And today, cancer is the leading cause of death by disease for children in the United States. From 1975 to 2019, incidence of childhood leukemia, which is the most common type of childhood cancer, increased by 35%. And we saw a similar increase in childhood brain cancer, which is another very common childhood cancer, of about 33% over the same time period. Nationally, 1 in every 285 American children is now diagnosed with cancer before age 20. And we're also seeing a substantial rise in cancers in young adults, people in their 20s, like my sister, over this same time period. We've also seen a similar increase in certain adult cancers, a much larger increase in some of these cases that are strongly linked to environmental exposures, including multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and testicular cancer. And some of these increases during this time period are really startling. That 76% increase for non-Hodgkin lymphoma is a really high increase. When I was reporting on that series on cancer and the environment back in 2019, I interviewed a very smart epidemiologist and pediatrician named Dr. Phil Landrigan, who later ended up writing the foreword to my book. And he said something that was a total light bulb moment for me. He said that this increase, particularly the increases in childhood cancers, are too fast to be due to genetic changes. So those happen over very long periods of time, and that our basic diagnostic tools for cancers like childhood leukemia are the same now as they were in the 70s. So this also isn't just a matter of diagnosing more of something that's always been there, that we've gotten better at measuring. So this is a real rapid increase in childhood cancer rates that we've seen. And the only other explanation is environmental factors, meaning anything that originates outside of our own bodies and our DNA. So that includes things like smoking and diet, as well as exposure to cancer-causing chemicals and pollution. And Dr. Landrigan pointed out that those lifestyle factors might play a significant role in adult cancers, but in general, kids aren't engaging in harmful lifestyle behaviors. So this photo is kind of funny because it's not typical and we assume it's a joke, although in 1955, anything's possible. But for the most part, kids are not smoking or drinking. Their parents might do those things, but over time, the percentage of parents who smoke and drink during pregnancy has declined, while childhood cancer rates have continued to climb. And one thing that has changed over that same time period is the number of chemicals that kids and all the rest of us are exposed to on a daily basis. Since the start of the early 20th century, more than 300,000 new chemicals have been invented, and these are all novel materials that never existed on the planet before we made them. They're manufactured in enormous quantities, and global production is on track to double by 2030. And some of these chemicals have been helpful and have saved lives and vastly improved our lives, but most of them have never been tested for safety. And among the ones that have been tested, most of the ones found to be harmful are still on the market, including many that we know are carcinogens. In the last 50 years, only 5 chemicals have been removed from US markets because they're harmful, although that might be, we might get a 6th here sometime soon. The World Health Organization has determined that more than 100 manufactured chemicals can cause cancer in humans. So where do we encounter them? These are just some of the places that we come into contact with these chemicals. This list is not comprehensive, and it includes some things that are suspected carcinogens. And many other chemicals we come into contact with regularly are endocrine disruptors, which disrupt our natural hormonal processes and contribute to things like obesity and neurodevelopmental problems. And evidence increasingly suggests that endocrine disrupting chemicals may play a role in the development of hormone-related cancers like breast cancer and prostate cancer. This list also doesn't include chemicals that cause other non-cancer health harms, of which there are many. And again, there are many more chemicals that we come into regular contact with that we just have never tested for safety, so we have no way of knowing. Our contact with plastics is another major source of these exposures. In 2021, researchers in Switzerland identified more than 10,000 chemicals used in plastics manufacturing. And I think that number has been updated actually in the last couple of years. I think now we're up to 14 or 15,000 chemicals that are used in plastics manufacturing. And they found that about a quarter of them are substances of potential concern, meaning they're endocrine disruptors, they can cause reproductive harm, they can damage specific organs or accumulate in the bodies of humans or animals, they're toxic to marine life, or they're carcinogens. And more than half of the chemicals the researchers identified as potentially concerning are unregulated in the United States. Even more alarming is that more than 900 of those chemicals are approved for contact with food in the United States. We're seeing some studies coming out just in the last few weeks about the chemicals in food packaging making their way into our bodies. And at least 1,000 of these concerning chemicals, including some carcinogens, were identified as being harmful even in very small doses. An additional 39% of the chemicals used in plastics manufacturing haven't been studied enough to determine whether they're hazardous. And this figure on the bottom is from a story I wrote about a few years ago, a study by a think tank that estimated that lawsuits against the plastics industry for health and environmental harm will exceed $20 billion by 2030. And these are some of the reasons they reached that conclusion. So I also want to talk a bit about how our war on cancer has been going so far. We are much, much better than we used to be at treating cancer, but we're also getting a lot more of it. So today, 1 in every 3 Americans can expect to get a cancer diagnosis in their lifetimes. And just because we're better at treatments does not mean we've solved the problem of cancer, right? More than 1,000 Americans still die of cancer every day. And treatment is really difficult. Therapies like chemo can have side effects that last over the course of your entire life, and survivors live with the fear that their disease might come back and have anxiety and deja vu every time they have to go in for a follow-up scan. I know I've seen that in my sister. And so we really should aim for something better than surviving cancer. So we're, I think, by most accounts, not winning this war right now. And if this story sounds familiar, you might have coming to mind right now how our war on drugs and our war on poverty are going in the United States. We have a tenuous history with kind of endless wars of this nature. But in this case, there's a really clear reason that we're not successfully preventing cancer, and that is that we are not funding cancer prevention. At the global level, just 7 to 9% of all cancer funding goes toward prevention. And I'm not a war expert, but if we stick with the war metaphor and we use that more generous estimate of 9%, this would be like spending 91% of our war budget on treating soldiers who came back from the battlefield wounded, and just 9% of our funding on offensive and defensive measures that could prevent them from getting hurt in the first place. I'm guessing none of us here are war budget experts, but we probably would all agree that this does not sound like a good plan. And I think it's, I wrote my book because it feels like we're well past time to launch an offensive war against cancer too, which we can do in the form of prevention. Right now, the tiny bit of funding that does go toward prevention tends almost exclusively focuses on lifestyle choices. So things like not smoking, diet, and exercise. Those things are super important and they matter for lots of reasons beyond just our cancer risk. They're important for our health. So they're worth prioritizing, they're worth funding. But as we've learned, those are also not the only things that influence our cancer risk. And so sometimes people can feel really empowered by focusing on those things that are within their direct individual control, but it can be overwhelming and confusing too. I spoke with one oncologist, Dr. Margaret Kripke, who also served on the presidential cancer panel. And she shared a story about meeting a young man who'd made all the right choices in his life. He ate super clean and healthy. He was a long distance runner. He'd never smoked. And he was completely shocked and then furious when he was diagnosed with cancer, because he'd been led to believe that this was something he could entirely control through his lifestyle choices. And he felt like he had been lied to when it turned out that wasn't the case. So a better alternative would be encouraging people to make those healthy lifestyle choices that we know make a difference, but also acknowledging that there are numerous factors that are beyond our ability to control as individuals, and then empowering people to advocate for a healthier world by pushing for meaningful systemic changes that could benefit all of us. I want to share a quick story about a public health victory that I think is really helpful in thinking about reframing the way we talk about cancer prevention. And a lot of you here might already be familiar with this story. In 1985, a groundbreaking study showed that sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, was rare in Hong Kong, where cultural norms had people putting their babies to sleep almost exclusively on their backs. And within 2 years, in 1987, the Netherlands started a public health campaign urging parents to put babies to sleep on their backs based on these findings. And it resulted in a steep decline in SIDS cases in the Netherlands. 2 years after that, in 1989, a group of American researchers felt strongly that the US should launch a similar campaign, but another group of researchers felt just as strongly that it was too soon, that we should not do that. The researchers, the scientists who were opposed to the campaign argued that the evidence was very limited. So it was just a couple of studies. No one in the research community could determine why putting babies to sleep on their stomachs made SIDS more likely. And they thought it was really important to figure out the mechanism before kind of disseminating this big public awareness campaign around this. Those who were in favor of launching a campaign were saying it doesn't matter, right? If lives could be saved, we should act sooner rather than later. And thankfully, those scientists who were in favor won that debate, and the Back to Sleep campaign was launched in the US in 1994. In the decades since then, the US has seen a reduction in SIDS of about 50%, which is a significant reduction. And now, more than 25 years later, scientists still don't completely understand why stomach sleeping makes SIDS more likely. But if we had waited until we had that information to act, we would still be waiting, and thousands more babies would have died as a result. So why is this instructive in a conversation about cancer prevention? We're in a similar place right now with childhood cancer risk specifically. And actually, we have much more evidence about environmental risk factors for childhood cancer than we had on risk factors for SIDS in 1994 when the Back to Sleep campaign was launched. Some people think it's really important now, today, to wait until we know exactly how, at a cellular level, exposure to certain chemicals cause cancer before we spend resources on preventing exposure to them. And as you can imagine, a lot of the people who think that work in the chemical manufacturing industry. But we know from our experience with SIDS that once we've identified a clear risk factor for disease, we don't need to wait decades for all of the mechanisms to be completely understood before we can take action to start protecting people. I want to talk a little more specifically about childhood cancer because there are some really clear pathways to action available here. There are 3 categories of chemicals with very robust scientific evidence linking exposure with common childhood cancers. And the first is pesticides. A 2020 meta-analysis looked at 55 studies from more than 30 countries and found that exposure to pesticides is clearly linked to a higher risk of childhood leukemia. The link existed for exposures that happen in infancy and childhood, but I found it really interesting that it was actually strongest for maternal exposures during pregnancy. Several independently conducted meta-analyses have also linked exposure to traffic-related air pollution with increased risk of childhood leukemia, particularly for exposures that happen in early childhood. And for paints and solvents, numerous meta-analyses have shown a link between exposure and childhood leukemia, particularly for maternal exposures before and during pregnancy. I think that one's especially shocking when you think about how many expecting parents spend time painting their future child's new room or repainting the house or being exposed to these chemicals. So all 3 of these categories also have really promising and relatively easy solutions available, and we should be pulling out the stops on those at this point. We should be educating parents and caregivers and clinicians about the dangers of pesticide use in our homes and gardens and at schools and daycares. We should continue to drive a shift toward electric vehicles and educate the public about the dangers of childhood exposure to traffic-related emissions in the meantime. We should educate the public about the risk of exposure to paints and solvents and support green chemistry initiatives aimed at developing safe alternatives to those materials. And it's worth noting that exposure to all 3 of these groups of pollutants are also associated with other health risks, including neurodevelopmental problems and respiratory effects that last into adulthood. So there are a lot of additional benefits beyond just reducing cancer risk that would come with mitigating these exposures. All the studies that I referenced on that previous slide are summarized in this 2020 report from the Childhood Cancer Prevention Initiative. It's free to download online, and it's the first report I'm aware of that summarizes all the peer-reviewed science on environmental exposures and cancer risk for children in one place. They also published a 2021 addendum with some new studies that's worth taking a look at. I think this is a really helpful resource. And that report also summarizes research on chemicals that are known to cause cancer in adults and are often present where kids play and go to school, but where there's research is lacking in terms of childhood cancer risk. These include chemicals like PFAS and BPA and benzoapyrene, which is found in crumb rubber, like the kind that's often used on playgrounds. And the authors noted that just because few studies have directly linked these chemicals to childhood cancers, that does not mean that exposure to carcinogenic materials is safe for children. And they conclude that wherever carcinogenic exposures to kids are plausible, these should also be priorities for prevention. There's also emerging evidence that certain chemical exposures during childhood increase our cancer risk much later in life, or even for future generations, which is another good reason to focus on preventing harmful exposures for pregnant people and in children. So for example, this 2021 study linked the use of certain hair products during adolescence with a higher risk of premenopausal breast cancer. Another example is this 2018 study that linked exposure to the pesticide DDT in early childhood with breast cancer risk in adulthood. And studies like these suggest that there are critical windows of development during childhood and adolescence where our exposure to cancer-causing chemicals increases our risk of developing cancer later on in adulthood. And I mentioned that there's emerging evidence that some of these exposures can also increase cancer risk for multiple generations. This one I thought was particularly striking. Previous studies had shown that mothers' exposure to DDT during pregnancy correlated with increased risk factors and incidence of breast cancer in their adult daughters. But then this 2021 study found a significant association between DDT levels in grandmother's blood during pregnancy and risk factors for breast cancer in their granddaughters. And before this 2021 study, researchers had established health effects from transgenerational exposure to chemicals in laboratory animals. But as far as I know, as far as these researchers know, this was the first time that that had been seen in humans. This is a quote from Barbara Cohn, who is one of the authors of that study, from an interview she did with one of my colleagues at Environmental Health News. And obviously this research is still developing and we need a lot more of it to have a thorough understanding about exactly what's going on and why. But thinking back to that Back to Sleep campaign story I told, and the causal pie theory of cancer risk, and those risk factors we already have lots of robust research on, I think it's clear that we have more than enough evidence right now to start taking actions that could prevent many cases of both childhood and adult cancer. And the good news is there are some really smart, really capable people who are already working very hard on this issue. These are some of them who I profiled in my book. And one of the reasons I wanted to write about these people, in addition to these issues and this research, is that it's so much easier to advocate for a cure for cancer than it is to advocate for prevention, because it's the nature of prevention that we just don't get to know whose life we saved, right? We're not going to get a heartfelt thank you from the family we spared the trauma of receiving a cancer diagnosis, because they won't know that. And it's really easy to feel empathy and want to pitch in when you know who you're fighting for. So when you can put the picture of a little girl's face on a t-shirt and enlist help in her battle against cancer, who wouldn't want to help with that? But when you're advocating for prevention, those stories are often told through numbers and statistics, which are really important and can be striking, but they're harder to connect with emotionally. And so one of the reasons, that I wanted to profile these humans is to kind of humanize the fight for cancer prevention. I wanted to put human faces to these numbers and also help people feel connected and inspired when thinking about cancer prevention. And it's also because I noticed that as I was starting to learn about this topic, and I started to feel like overwhelmed by it and a little depressed about it, I felt so much better when I had these in-depth conversations with people who've devoted their lives and their careers to this work. And it made me also want to get involved in that movement and do what I could to help instead of feeling kind of hopeless. So I'm going to share a little bit about two of these folks today. I can't tell you about all of them because my publisher wouldn't be very happy with me, but there's a lot more in the book. This is Melanie Mead. She's a clean air advocate in Clairton, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 minutes from where I'm sitting now in Pittsburgh. And she lives beside a heavily polluting industrial site, US Steel's Clairton Coke Works. It's the biggest Coke making plant in the country. Coke is an ingredient used in steel making, and it's done by heating coal to extremely high temperatures. So the emissions are extremely carcinogenic. And this is Melanie outside her family home in 2021. US Steel frequently violates clean air laws and just pays the fines because it's cheaper than modernizing their operations would be. And Clairton regularly sees some of the worst air quality in the country as a result. I have this figure here that Melanie's hometown is in a county that's in the top 1% of all US counties for cancer risk caused by air pollution. And I also live in that same county. It's Allegheny County, which also encompasses Pittsburgh. Melanie's family has been in Clairton for multiple generations, farming on the land long before the steel company came to town. This is her, she's there on the far left with her mom and dad and aunt and two of her sisters. Most of the men in Melanie's family worked at the Coke plant at some point in their lives, either for careers or for summer jobs. And a lot of the women in her family worked there too at various points. Melanie was one of 4 kids. but over the span of 8 years, from 2013 to 2021, she lost both of her parents and all 3 of her siblings to cancer, respiratory disease, or heart disease. And this picture is her dad when he was a baby. So Melanie is the only surviving person in her immediate family. And this is the family home in Clairton where she grew up. It's also where her grandparents lived, and it's where she still lives today. After Melanie's parents died within 6 months of each other, she learned for the first time at a community meeting held by local activists how bad the air pollution is in Clairton from US Steel's emissions. And she realized it likely played a role in her parents' health issues, which was something she hadn't thought about before that meeting. And right away, she felt compelled to action by that information. So since then, she has helped to organize countless community meetings and rallies, and she's pleaded on the local news for health officials to do more about the air quality and enforce clean air regulations. And she's also told her family's story in public testimony to local county and state politicians, including former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf. In addition to losing her immediate family, Melanie has also watched many members of her extended family and her community die of cancer and respiratory disease. And she gets really disheartened sometimes in staying and engaging in this work, but she's dedicated to fighting for her community's right to breathe clean air, rather than just wanting to leave. And change is often slow and slower than we'd like it to be in these situations, but Melanie's story is proof that it does happen. The local health department here has stepped up enforcement of clean air laws in recent years, and US Steel recently shut down 3 of the oldest, dirtiest coke ovens at the Clairton Coke Works, in large part because of pressure from Melanie and other community activists like her. And I've actually been writing a lot about Clairton recently because you may have heard that Nippon Steel, Japanese steel company, is trying to buy US Steel, and it's really unclear what that might mean for these communities in Western Pennsylvania that are exposed to the company's pollution. These recent improvements in air quality aren't going to entirely solve Clairton's problems, but it's expected to significantly improve air quality. And I think Melanie's story really moves me, in part because she's close by, and this is my airshed too, obviously, but also because, more importantly, I know that there are Melanie Meads all over the world who are fighting for the health of their communities against really impossible odds. And I find it so inspiring when people are willing to stay and continue fighting. I initially thought I would travel to Cancer Alley and write about Cancer Alley in the book in Louisiana, but I realized that I had a similar issue happening right here in my backyard where I live, and Clairton, Pennsylvania is in the national media a lot less often than Louisiana is. I also want to talk briefly about Ami Zoda. She's a population health scientist with expertise in environmental health, environmental justice, and maternal and reproductive health. Some of you may know her. She's also an associate professor in the Environmental Health Sciences Department at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. And she's a founding director of Agents of Change in Environmental Justice, which is a program run in partnership with Columbia University and Environmental Health News, where I work. Agents of Change highlights the voices of people who've been historically underrepresented in scientific research, like women and people of color. And I want to give a quick plug for Agents of Change. I'm not directly involved in it, but it's really cool. There are essays and podcasts from a lot of really brilliant early career researchers, and it's really powerful. It might also be a program that some of you might be interested in applying for or participating in. How are we on time? I'm gonna rush some of this a little bit. Okay. Ami was among the first researchers to frame the disproportionate burden of toxic exposures from beauty and personal care products among women of color as an environmental justice concern. She co-developed a framework called the Environmental Injustice of Beauty, which links racism, sexism, and classism to adverse environmental health outcomes. So for example, in 2015, Ami co-authored one of the first scientific studies to look at the connection between race and exposure to toxic chemicals found in feminine care products. And it found that using products like vaginal douches can contribute to phthalate exposure, and that compared to white women, higher rates of douching among Black women contribute to higher rates of exposure to certain phthalates. But here's where Ami's work is really revolutionary. She also insists that we have to contextualize why vaginal douching is more prevalent among Black women in order to get to the heart of this issue. So historically, white colonizers and enslavers used real or invented racial differences like skin color, hair texture, and vaginal odor as justifications for treating women of color as less than human. And striving to erase those real or invented differences became a survival adaptation. And the continued prevalence of vaginal douching among Black women is a lingering effect of that adaptation. Similarly, women of color are more likely to use hair relaxers and straighteners to achieve straight hair, and those products marketed to women of color contain more toxic chemicals than hair products marketed to white women, which also contributes disproportionately to disproportionate exposure to harmful chemicals in women of color. So these things happened long ago when our systems were more racist and sexist than they are today, but if we don't take them into consideration, we're missing a huge part of the puzzle when it comes to figuring out why these disproportionate chemical exposures and disproportionate rates of disease are impacting people of color. And this is, I'm skipping a slide because I'm a little short on time, but if people want more information about this, I'd be happy to share it afterwards. This quote comes from Ami's paper on incorporating intersectionality into environmental health research, and I think it's particularly relevant to this group. And I highlighted the phrase "and address" here because I think this is really a call to action for researchers and clinicians. And how I read this is saying that, you know, we can't actually address health disparities that are caused by environmental injustice without also addressing racial injustice. So how can the rest of us join this fight? I know I mentioned that when I started learning about this, it felt a little overwhelming and scary, and I think that's a pretty common response to starting to learn about these issues and how prevalent these exposures are in our lives. And I think a lot of people, when people start learning about this, when it comes to cancer risks, they tend to fall into two camps. The first one is the camp where you become completely obsessed with this and you decide you're going to be an organic goddess and never let a conventionally grown vegetable in your kitchen again, and throw away all of your toxic personal care products and radically change your lifestyle. Or two is to throw up your hands because this is just way too overwhelming and everything causes cancer nowadays, so it's probably best to just try not to think about all of this too much. But the third option, which is really what I'm advocating for in my book, is collective action to reduce these sources of exposure in our lives and work together to go on the offensive against cancer. And I think it's important to say that this doesn't necessarily mean that we will all become Melanie Meads and head to the streets with bullhorns, because there's a role for all different types of people in this work. But if that does sound appealing to you, you absolutely should do that. But a couple of other ways that we can all pitch in tend to fall into these three categories, and I'll talk about these just briefly so we have time for questions. Before I jump into those, I just want to mention that in the book, I asked all of these people who've devoted their lives and their careers to this work about, you know, what individual actions do you take to kind of reduce you and your family's exposures? And everyone gave me their kind of tips. These are a few of them on this page. There are more of them in the book, and there are entire programs dedicated to helping people make these kind of individual lifestyle changes. One really good one is called the Anti-Cancer Lifestyle Program. They have tons of free resources on changes you can make as an individual and for your family to reduce harmful exposures that raise your cancer risk. But one thing I heard over and over again from the people I spoke to for the book was that this problem is just too big for any of us to entirely solve on our own, and that it's worth taking a couple actions that feel accessible for you, but it's not something you can go crazy over at the individual level, because it's just not possible to entirely avoid these exposures. And more importantly, we need to take some of that energy and put it toward pushing for systemic change that will keep us all safer. So the first thing we can do that's really easy and accessible is supporting cancer prevention initiatives that are aimed at reducing our exposure to harmful chemicals. And one really easy way to do this is donating time or money to organizations that are leading this work so that we can help power up their efforts. Another way is to sign up for these groups' newsletters or follow them on social media so we can quickly answer their calls to action about things like signing petitions or calling lawmakers about pending bills and voting on relevant legislation. A lot of these fights are actually won at the state level. So federal shifts are important, but it's also really important to find out who's advocating around this issue in your state and throw in some support at the state level, because those changes tend to be easier to achieve. And this is just a handful of the groups that are leading this work. I have an appendix in my book that has a much more extensive list. The second way is pushing for better chemical regulations, which I feel like everyone, especially this time of year, it's hard to hear that you need to contact your lawmakers, but it's true. They assume that if they hear from two people about an issue, that those two people represent a much larger group of people who didn't bother reaching out. There are pretty regularly petitions going around related to better chemical regulations at the state and federal level. And there are a few websites you can use to sign up for notifications about proposed federal and state regulations related to carcinogens in the environment, so that you kind of know what's going on and can contact people when it's timely. And the last way is applying market pressure. I think we're all familiar with this idea of kind of voting with our wallets, but you can really amplify the choices you make when it comes to shopping many times over if you take a few minutes to tell both companies why you're switching products. So for example, if you tell company A that you love their hand cream, you've been using it for your whole life, your mom used it too, but now you're going to stop using it and switch because you've learned that it includes ingredients that might be raising your cancer risk. And then you also take a few minutes to tell the company you're switching to, I'm so excited to switch to your product for these reasons. Companies start to take note of that. We've already seen company now on Amazon, you can search for environmental working group verified skincare products, for example, that the EWG has given their seal of approval. So we see the ways that market pressure can incentivize companies to use healthier ingredients. In terms of market pressure, you can also apply this when it comes to your investment accounts. A lot of the cancer-causing chemicals we come into contact with in our daily lives are derived from fossil fuels. So divesting from fossil fuel companies and investing in companies that are advancing green chemistry is another way to apply market pressure. And finally, you can help spread the word and get others to join the fight by reading and sharing my book. I like to mention it's also available as an audiobook, because I'm a big audiobook person. And I always like to close with this quote by the cultural anthropologist, Margaret Mead, because it makes me feel ready to fight. I also wanted to mention, there's a discount code for my book. I don't have one for the audiobook, but if you buy it from the publisher, you can get 20% off if you use the code WAR. If you read it and you like it, or even if you don't like it, please leave a review. That would be super helpful. Okay, perfect. And I think I will close there so we have time for some questions.
Kristina, thank you so much. That was really amazingly done. I appreciate how you built the case. And then I appreciate a lot about what you did. One thing though that stands out is this idea of like how our individual choices might be a focus, which I would say that's mine as a trained toxicologist. And I will add, even in that case, I do things that I later I'm like, why did I do that? Knowing what I know, why did I make that choice? But so your framing of the individual choice versus kind of this broader, we're all in this, let's take this on together. So I appreciate that framing a lot. It's going to make me think. We have some questions that are popping up into our Q&A, and we have some from people who registered, and I want to try to capture them. I'm seeing three big kind of themes. One to establish first, though, is from our Q&A, and that's a question about in Allegheny County, as your example. If you could just kind of clarify or confirm or talk about how lifestyle factors were accounted for, because that is one of the complicating things when we think about cancer, knowing what caused it, because from time of exposure to expression of the disease can be so long. And so causal factors are complicated, and humans are complicated. So if maybe you could just talk briefly about what you know about how that was considered in Allegheny County specifically, or in general.
Sure. So when they're asking about Allegheny County, I assume this is in reference to that top 1% cancer risk figure. That came from a study that was led by Jim Fabisek, who is also a toxicologist, and he directs the University of Pittsburgh's Center for Environmental, it's like, I'm not going to remember the acronym, but it's like the Community Center for Environmental Health, something like that. And it's from a few years ago, but he really, I can share the report after if folks are interested in looking at his methodology in detail. But he looked at emissions data throughout the county for hazardous air pollutants, which we have pretty good data on from the EPA. And so that number pertains to cancer risk, not cancer rates, right? So it's 1% of cancer risk from air toxics. So he was measuring, to get to the number, he was measuring the level of carcinogens and air toxics that are present and emitted throughout the county, and comparing that with other geographic regions to come up with this estimate of cancer risk rather than talking about cancer rates. And one of the reasons is that it's so much more difficult, to measure rates and consider the time lag and consider confounding factors. So we also have some really interesting research that's been previously published, and I know there's more coming out by David Kriebel, and I'm forgetting the name of his colleague, but some researchers, I think they're connected with Lowell, Massachusetts. And they looked at if smoking had been eliminated 20 years ago, and we removed the expected number of cancer cases that we see from the amount of smoking that happens in various counties, is there anything we can learn from how high cancer rates would still stay in specific geographic regions throughout the country? And they found that Allegheny County and a handful of other counties, and certainly they saw a difference between like urban and rural counties, but in Allegheny County in particular, the decline in cancer rates, if all smoking had been eliminated 20 years ago, was very small compared to many other places that have lower levels of air pollution and fewer air toxics. So, which suggests that, of course, smoking is important and we know it plays a role, but even if you remove that as a factor, we're still seeing elevated cancer rates, specifically as a result of air pollution. And I think that kind of research is a really interesting, different way to kind of get at some of these questions.
Yeah. I think I'm going to keep this one as a comment and then go into my final question. There was also in the comments kind of accolades to you for talking about the emotional reactions to being cured and how that creates long-term fear. And I would just say, this is such an important area for me. One of my driving factors in developing this speaker series was to try to get at some of those other things besides the physiological expression of what happens when you're exposed to a toxic. So fear, changes in economic situation. I mean, and the fear, if we go back to that one, my mom died when I was young from cancer. And so I have lived a life of fear of cancer. And so what does that mean for all of us? I mean, these are real things that we just don't think about and don't study very much. And so thank you for bringing that up. And I would love to see more of us thinking and working and talking about that aspect of disease, especially those that are associated with chemical exposures, which is what I think about. So I guess the other final kind of big theme that I'm seeing is thinking about how you communicate these issues. And I would kind of pull in some of my own examples from the classroom. I've heard students say, oh, everything causes cancer. And so they just kind of, you know, brush it off and don't worry about these things. I come from Southern West Virginia, a coal miner country, and know that their economic viability is based on extraction of resources that causes disease. And we know this, and that creates a totally different kind of cultural norm and way of thinking about these, and acceptance of risk and benefit, or right. And then you have people who just maybe don't have the interest or the educational background to think about this. So thinking about just all of those things that we all walk into these conversations from different places and with different lenses and interests, communicating, like what do we do? How do we do it? Just what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and that's something this region is the same as what you described in West Virginia, where we have this history of extractive industries being here and of people being reliant on them. And then there's this added aspect of some sort of cultural pride about contributing to America's economy and energy independence. So it becomes really complicated to talk with those people about, like, but is this industry harming your family and your community? And I think, yeah, it's a huge question. I think what I'm trying to do in the whole book is like figure that out and communicate this in a way that says, it doesn't have to be like this. And here are some ways that we can make it less like this. I think I really try to focus in the book on wins too. I think I felt a lot better knowing that there have been these public health victories. For example, the way California changed its legislation related to fire retardant chemicals after learning that they were associated with lots of health risks. And that was very directly, Ami Zoda is one of the researchers who testified in front of state legislators and got a bunch of phone calls and like published research and then talked to lawmakers and then saw the law change. And so I feel a lot better knowing, I think telling those stories helps sometimes. Like, did you know we used to have this additional risk? And then because people did research about it and advocated about it, we're now all safer. Even though we didn't have to be involved because other people were advocating on our behalf. And I think that when you compare it with those stories of like, we have seen victories and people can like participate in some of the relief about that, especially in instances where there have been follow-up studies that have shown, lives saved. The Clean Air Act is really easy to talk about, how many lives per year are saved by the Clean Air Act and how many billions of dollars in public health funding. I think that focusing on victories and kind of keeping the communication, as opposed to like, everything's bad, everything's scary, watch out, being like, everything could be better. Everything could be better, everything could be safer, your kids could be safer. Also comparing, I do a lot of this in the book, talking about chemical policy in the United States and how it's different from other countries that have more health protective chemical policies. I think can also be instructive because it makes it feel less impossible, right? It's like, oh, other places have figured out how to do a better job of this, and it's not unachievable. It's like these little steps we can take. I think that helps people avoid feeling too overwhelmed or despairing.
Yeah. Okay. I really appreciate you being here and helping us kick off this 5th year of our series. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.